All right. So, hi, everybody, and good evening again. My name is Annick Jackman, host of the Caribbean Masterclasses. Very happy to have you all join us because we are launching season 2. Can you believe that? Season 2. This started as a dream during COVID. It was something that came up as a creative process during COVID. And we are so happy to be in season 2 and to launch season 2 with the guest that we have this evening. Now, a few years ago, I had the distinct pleasure of listening to Marla Dukharan present. And I was blown away with the power and the passion with which she spoke to our audience. So I began to follow her and I listened to when she did her TED talk, follow her brand in terms of what she's posting on LinkedIn, webinars, even Twitter, where I got to see so many interesting comments that she posed. And again, it just reinforced how much of a treasure she is for us in the Caribbean region. The Caribbean masterclasses have been developed and designed in the vein of master classes, but honoring and recognizing our thought leaders, our creatives, and our industry experts from right here in the Caribbean, because I think they're fantastic and very often we don't get to hear their story and get tips directly from them and interact with them the way we would like to. So, with the advent of Zoom technology, now we are able to welcome people from all over the Caribbean and the world to these masterclasses, introduce them to people they've never met before, or just reinforce the talent that we have already existing. So, do me a favor. We have our chat button. So please feel free and let us know where you're coming from, where you're representing. It's always great for us. We have a lovely subscription base, but it's always great for us in the webinars to find out where our audience is coming from. So put it in the chat so we can see it, and maybe throughout the session we can say a special hello. So when we look at Marla, she has had a long, distinguished career. She's recognized as an economist and advisor on the Caribbean. She's led discussions and she's published reports on the Caribbean implications of everything from COVID-19 to Brexit to the changing US and Chinese policies. She's a highly sought after keynote speaker internationally, and she speaks on a lot of our Caribbean issues. She regularly advises private sector executives, investors, and multinationals to support their strategic decisions in the Caribbean. She also serves on the Government of Barbados's Jobs Investment Council Finance and Insurance Committee. She's a member of the advisory board to the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, and she sits on the board of director of Royal Fidelity and of Goddard's Enterprises Limited. Marla is also a mom to two teenagers and an avid marathoner. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up to Marla Dukharan. Yay! I'm cheering on behalf of the audience because you can't hear them. So I'm going to cheer for them.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Annick. I appreciate it. I remember when we met in Cayman, and I was blown away by what you were wearing. And I still remember it. It was so bright and colorful and West Indian, but I've never been able to get my hands on anything quite so flamboyant and beautiful.
One of a kind, one of a kind. Yeah. But you know what was interesting is that during that time, you were at a tourism conference, so you were talking about some of the issues that impact tourism for the Caribbean, and you touched on something that you said you're passionate about, and that's the representation of women, and gender equality as one of those areas that's particularly special for you. And in fact, Marla, when you and I were talking about this masterclass, I actually thought that women were a minority when you're looking at economists for the Caribbean. I honestly, because I know you so well and I see you out there, that I almost thought like you were just the only one, or there was just so few female economists. And you said something interesting to me. You said we are here, but we're hidden. We're here, but we're hidden. So why is it? I guess to pose my first question, because this is just coming out of my own misconceptions. Why is it that female economists are seemingly hidden? And then what made your circumstances so different?
Well, first, let me deal with the first part of the question is why are we hidden? Um, you know, I think that I don't have the data, right? So I'm going here on guess and on anecdotal evidence in terms of the gender split in my classes at university. And I think that women are well represented in this field of economists. And in general, in the Caribbean, we have what is called a negative gender gap as it relates to education, meaning that women are more highly educated than men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the general population. In the general population, women are more highly educated than men. Yet still, women represent a smaller proportion of the labor force than men, meaning our labor force participation rate is lower, okay, in general. So what that means is that, let's just say, the average woman and the average man, same, education level, or maybe the woman is more highly educated, chances are has a greater chance of not being employed than he does. And there are all kinds of reasons for this, for women's lower participation in the labor force. But of course, one of them is the fact that we do 2 to 3 times more unpaid care work in the home compared to men.
Mm-hmm.
So let's shrink that down to women, and to economists. Of the female economists I know, there are some who are not in the labor force because, they decided to be at-home moms, which I did, by the way, for about 4 years of my life.
Okay.
Until my kids started primary school. And so there's that factor. And then there are other factors. So maybe they decided to stay at home to care for elderly parents or to start their own business. So there are those reasons. But to address what I had said to you, which I believe is also a factor, that women who are economists are largely hidden. What I mean by that is, in the first place, in any meeting, it's very difficult for us to be heard. There was a study that came out last week where it talks about how difficult it is for women to be heard in meetings, and how many times men talk over women, and how there were percentages that were calculated of how much time in every meeting, and say in any 1 hour meeting, is spent where men are speaking versus women, even when the men are outnumbered by the women in the room. So that's the first thing. It is harder for us to be heard, which is why we are hidden. The second thing is, of the women who are economists that I know, the majority of them are in the central banks, in the ministries of finance, et cetera, and in the development banks. And that's what I mean when I say they're hidden. They're in technocrat roles, I guess you can say, policy-making roles in some instances. And so their voices are not really, they're not really allowed to be heard. It's really the voice of the organization that is heard. So that's what I mean when I say we have many female economists in the region, but you won't hear many of them and you won't see many of them. And you know what? Some of them want that and prefer that role. And I have to tell you that it's not necessarily my preference, and it certainly wasn't something that I sought out to be in the limelight and to be this economist who speaks publicly so often. It's where my career took me, and I put up a lot of resistance, for years. And I think that only, I would say maybe from about 2015 or so. So in the last 5 years or so have I become a lot more comfortable with it.
Okay. And it's so interesting because when you see you speaking and presenting, and when you watch your videos and so on, you wouldn't realize that that's kind of the shy personality in the background. it's so interesting. Yeah. So you were actually, because this session is about creating a thought leadership brand, so you were actually given a little that push to be out there and to be so vocal and for people to see you. And that's interesting. Can you share, in terms of where that, when you say that journey started, what was required for you, to be able to do something like that?
So I would say, I started writing for public consumption, back in the 1990s, late 1990s, when I was at Republic Bank and worked under the economist for the bank, who was Dr. Ronald Ramkissoon at the time. And that was, where I started really writing and developed a joy for writing. And then at Caribbean Money Market Brokers, which was then a subsidiary of Jamaica Money Market Brokers in Trinidad, as the head of research, it was one of those, we needed to establish our brand as thought leaders. And to do that, we had lots of, traders and research, myself, risk managers and so on, who would speak publicly on various issues. And it was just something we had to do. And of course, I was very reluctant, and it made me very nervous. And there was this morning program. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, you would have to be in the TV station, and they would put your makeup on. And I don't like makeup, and I don't like cameras, and I don't like being, that early in the morning, up and about. It was just, there was nothing about it that I liked. And resisted quite a lot, and then made my staff do it. And I would say, no, you need to learn to do this, because this is the succession plan. So that was where this is where I really wet my feet, in doing that. But I guess I came to accept that it was part of what you do as an analyst, is to share your analysis, whether you write it or you use different media, you write or you speak about it, right? And you're interviewed and questioned and so on. So that's, how and the thing is, once the topic was something I was interested in, I kind of sometimes forgot that there was a camera and would get all wrapped up in the subject matter. And that was always where I felt like it was worth it. And also, one of the things that happens that I suppose didn't think about and didn't expect, but in hindsight I should have, is that you lose your anonymity. You walk down the street and people call your name and that kind of thing. And that's kind of, in a society like Trinidad, that can be scary. So that's another thing that kind of was sort of scary for me, apart from the cameras and everything else. And then at RBC, when I was after I spent about 4 years, as I said, as an at-home mom, when I had my 2 kids in 2005 and 2007, and started at RBC in 2011 when my son finally went off to primary school. And my CEO at the time said, I don't want a two-handed economist. I don't want you to tell me, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I want a one-handed economist. and I don't want anybody who sits on a fence. And you have to have an opinion, and you have to assert yourself and in having that opinion. So And that was when, part of my responsibility was, again, to establish RBC's brand in the Caribbean as thought leaders, as it relates to economic issues, as it even relates to, so investments and so on. And so that's where I really started to take on a much more regional role in terms of monitoring pretty much all the economies in the Caribbean, apart from the French-speaking territories, and also, meeting clients, meeting policymakers, and gathering information, doing analyses, sharing those analyses publicly in writing, as well as in presentations and interviews with the media, et cetera, et cetera. All while being careful and mindful of what I'm saying, because there's a brand that I represent. So some of the things that I say now, I could not have said then. And some of the engagements that I can take on now and speak on certain platforms now, I could not have then. And I still shy away and don't comment on certain things like political issues and so on. I try my best, to stay away from those things. But that's where it really, that's what got me here, basically.
And so, for our audience who are listening, and you're taking notes of this whole element of the thought leadership brand and establishing that, because, I was reading up, what constitutes thought leaders, and, they said it's not even just being an expert in your field, but it's your ability to engage people, so that people can, when they hear you speak or they read what you've written, they go, that makes sense to me now, or, oh, I didn't look at it like that. So you as a thought leader, you aren't just contributing to content, but you are creating that, and you're not just part of the conversation, but you're leading, or you're even starting those conversations that are necessary. So already, the idea of, for those of us who maybe even starting might be feeling shy about the creation of our brand, but we're good writers, that's where Marla started in terms of writing, with the research and the data, et cetera. And then it moved into public facing, where you started to be more engaged with the public, doing the appearances, et cetera. And then the third one, which I think is so poignant or really, really important, is that you have to have an opinion. You can't be a two-handed economist. You go on the one hand or the other.
You can't sit on the fence.
So you can't sit
you
on
have
the
to pick
fence.
a side.
Yes. And sometimes that's so difficult for people to do. But actually, I think that is one of the reasons why you're so respected, because you are very, very kind of focused on what you share, and they know it's a very specific kind of statement or focus that you have, that you give to the public. So you talk about your love for this, and the fact that actually transcended your fear of even being sometimes on camera. And this love started at what, age 16? That, yeah. So who got you interested in economics of all subjects? And I'm just saying that because I'm a literary person. So I'm like, yes. How did that start?
So in A levels, it's so funny. I was actually doing a talk like this to the Young Economists Association last Saturday. And so they all understood when I said that, I opened the John Beardshaw macroeconomics text for A levels for the first time. That would have been 1991, maybe. Yeah, 1991, a long time ago. And just absolutely fell in love. And I felt like everything made so much sense. And I felt like everything just fell into place in my head. And all of a sudden, I knew that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I just
Wow.
knew. I knew, and I feel so blessed because I know so many people who aren't quite sure that what they're doing is what they love, who aren't quite sure what they love, who
Right.
aren't quite sure what they want to do for their with their lives. I knew from 16, so I am very, very, very blessed. I mean, the Lord was so good to me. And I remember I'm really good in math too. And I remember one of my uncles coming over, and when I had signed up to do economics at university, and all of his kids did engineering, and he said to my parents, why are you letting her do economics? She's good in math, she should do engineering. What is she ever going to do with an economics degree? Like, she'll never make any money. You'll have to look after her for the rest of your life. And my dad was like, that we can't tell her what to do. It's just not like, that's just not how it works, right? But I think that they knew how much
Yes.
I loved economics, and they saw how much I excelled. I got the highest grade in A levels in school, in that high school. And it came naturally to me. So I think for them
Right.
to have even suggested that I do any other subject would not have gone down well. But anyway, so that's why I'm here. Fell in love with economics. To me, economics explains everything. It explains why we're
Okay.
here right now having this conversation.
Okay.
And I also felt like not only does it explain everything, and to your point earlier about when you're sharing with people and establishing thought leadership, quote unquote, it's about how you convey this to the average person and the not so average person.
Right.
And be able to make a connection with them and be able to help them to see things as they are and to understand how things are working around them. I mean, I have very educated people who are like doctors and pilots and lawyers and so on. And, they have these questions. And when you talk to them and you explain, they're like, oh. So it's just, and that always gives me a thrill and a high to be able to explain whatever economic phenomenon to someone and they get it. That really makes me, it satisfies my soul, and so that's why I do what I do as well, because I believe that none of this should be so mysterious and so jargony and confusing. There is nothing about economics that needs to be you know shrouded in all of this mystery and jargon and confusion and formulae. It doesn't need to be. It's actually, to me, quite commonsensical and straightforward and no, as we say, we have an expression in Trinidad, there's no maths in that. There really isn't. It's actually not complicated unless you want it to be, and there are times when it can be, but it doesn't have to be.
I think you hit on something, because I think that's what struck a chord with me when I first heard you present, is the fact that I could clearly understand it, because, when you say economics, for me, I don't know if I should mumble this, but then sometimes I start glazing over and I'm like, because I just feel like in the past, as people explained it, it just became interestingly hard. And you, and I love
think
that
some
you do
people
that.
get a kick. I actually think some people get a kick out of sounding confusing and and confusing their audience. And,
Okay.
so they probably think they sound smart when they say things that nobody understands. But then what did you really do? You just wasted everybody's time, including your own.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, a key tip in terms of when you're looking at thought leadership, as Marla says, you have to make sure that what you're sharing, any and everybody, they can pick up and understand and make that connection. And I thought very, very, just as a bit of fun, Marla, I saw something you did in your Twitter, where you talked to, it was a TED talk asking about the 5 love languages, and you said getting all economists must be a love language. So
It has to be.
and so and talking about things that are impacting what's happening around us. I want to just very quickly say to our audience, please put your comments, your questions in the chat for Marla, because I can chat very happily and ask lots of questions for Marla, but this is all about you as well. So put those in the chat for us, or in the Q&A section, and we'll address those. But Marla, when you look at what is happening with the pandemic that has shaken us all globally to our core, what are some of the things that you are seeing for the Caribbean? And what are some of the things, that we have to bear in mind as a region in terms of how we handle and how we move forward?
I think that the thing that has struck me the most and disappointed me the most is that this thing called regional integration and greater regional cooperation that I know for sure I have been hearing about since, I was in high school. We still can't get that right. And there's so many rewards and gains that we can benefit from if we could just cooperate and coordinate better as a region, even if not integrate, because integration has all kinds of, it's a loaded word in this region, right?
You're right.
And I feel like just even procuring the vaccine, why haven't we been able to come together as a region to procure the vaccine? And I think a simple thing like, when this pandemic hit and we heard all kinds of things about supply chains, ventilators being held in the US and all kinds of, and food shipments not being sent, it also drives that point home about integration, that if we pursued something akin to what the dream of the Federation was about, where we have a sort of a division of labor, where countries like Guyana and Suriname, for example, would have been the breadbasket of the region and would have produced the majority of the food because they're better equipped. And then the other ones handle different things. I think that if we got to a system like that, we would be so much better off. But we're so obsessed, some of our leaders, with our own sovereignty and independence and autonomy that I think that that's really at the level of the politicians. I don't even call some of them leaders, but politicians. And I think that it's a huge wasted opportunity. So I would say to you, Annick, that, out of this pandemic, if we could have gotten greater regional cooperation going, it would have been worthwhile to have suffered this pandemic. But I remain disappointed that we haven't gotten that going.
And what do you think for the average person in the region to understand? What do you think is important for the average person in the region to understand or to kind of look at this time? Because for many of us, we are looking to our leadership for direction in this, because so many people have been impacted, whether it's their jobs, losing their jobs, and the fear of what that means for provision for family, etc. What is it that you think is key for us to, for us to even do in our little world? Is there anything that we can do in our little world as the average citizen of Jamaica, Barbados, Cayman,
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that if it's one thing that I would take away from this pandemic, and it's something I talk to my children about as well, is how much we are interconnected and interdependent as individuals, as families, communities. And so, I suppose many times you go through your day before this pandemic and you don't really pay attention to what's happening to the people around you. But now, because everybody is a risk getting close to you, you kind of have to pay attention. But more broadly, we know that this is hitting everybody hard. And I think that my takeaway from this pandemic is how much more considerate and compassionate we need to be to each other, to our environment, to those in our community, and really not be so insular. I think that as individuals, as communities, as countries in this region, we had become very, very insular. And again, my earlier comment about the lack of regional cooperation, it pains me, because I think that insularity and this, no man is an island. And so, and I think that if it's one thing, my takeaway is how much we are interdependent on each other. And therefore, how much we need to spend the time and the effort and the energy that it takes to make sure that everybody is doing okay. Because if we don't, then it turns around and it affects you as well. And I think that point was really well made in this pandemic, that you might think you're okay, and your kids are okay, and it doesn't matter what else is happening with everybody else. But that's definitely not what this pandemic has taught us, that we all need herd immunity. We all need to be safe, and we all need to be healthy. Otherwise, any person who isn't poses a risk to us. So that's one thing. The other thing I would suggest as well, ironically, is how much this pandemic has shown us that we don't need. I mean, there's so much, I think, that we thought our lives depended on. I used to travel at least once a month and go shopping when I travel. I don't like shopping, but children give me a list. So, and I think that this pandemic taught us how much we actually did not need all the things that we thought we needed. Right. And so it's a good way to re-examine your lifestyle and re-examine what you thought were the things that you were so dependent. I mean, the first couple of months of this pandemic, this lockdown, I thought I was going to lose my mind because I wasn't at the airport on a plane going somewhere, And now I feel like I don't ever have to go anywhere again. If I never leave this place, I'll be okay. So it's amazing how your perspective changes when a dose of reality hits you. And so I think it's important that we all take a look and make sure that we understand what are the things we really need, what are the things that are really important, and focus on those things and not all of the trivialities that we thought were important.
Very interesting points, and points that actually hit home, because for us here in the Cayman Islands, it was interesting to see who in your neighborhood you wouldn't expect to be so heavily affected, while others were quite fine. It just depended on the industry you were in. If you were in tourism, then you knew that there were people who were struggling, or you had your nannies and health and caregivers, who were struggling. And those were all people in your community. We have some questions for you, Marla, so I guess I should keep quiet and pose them.
Sure.
So first of all, we just had a comment to say, they thoroughly agree with what you said in terms of the lack of regional cooperation. And it says, our region lacks that level of camaraderie, understanding. We can move forward together rather than fall apart on our own. And now we have another question for you, an interesting one. It says, you were very good at math. Any suggestions on how to improve math scores at the secondary level, school level in the Cayman Islands?
I had a really good teacher, and I loved her, and she loved math. And, I think having a good teacher makes all the difference in the world. I don't know that there's any other technique I would talk about, except that you know, getting connected with someone who has a passion for this subject and who can really teach. Because I clearly, as much as I love math, when I try to help my children, one of us always ends up in tears, right? So I am not a teacher. And so despite how much I love it and how good I am at it, I suck at teaching. And so, yeah, one of us always ends up in tears. And so I stopped. But yeah, get a good teacher.
And that's interesting, because if you think about it, that's the basis with which you start to, for you, helped you to build a career and a brand. And it's when you have that strong, solid education, or the foundation of teachers who inspire and ignite, that kind of enthusiasm and energy towards a subject area, so that at 16 you knew.
Yeah.
So we have some other questions coming in from the Q&A. You mentioned federation. This is from Anne. What are your thoughts on the role of CARICOM during this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, CARICOM really is I think, in need of some significant reforms. And they know this. I mean, the Golding Report was the most recent, but there were many. But I think the idea of CARICOM is exactly what we need. The idea of the CSME is exactly what we need. We have just been really bad at implementing and executing and driving that regional integration that I think can take us from where we are now to a real major and much needed transformation, socioeconomic transformation. And it breaks my heart that you know what, when you think about it, CARICOM is CARICOM, right? And there are so many disappointments that we can talk about. But I think that the private sector has done a really good job of showing us how we can, as a region, how integration can look, because you have so many corporate entities, banks, insurance companies, Sol, Goddard's, Massey, Grace Kennedy, Ansa McCall, all of them that are pan-Caribbean and are successful. So if they can do it and they can demonstrate to us how you can have a regional entity that works well, then clearly something's wrong with the machinery behind the regional institutions like CARICOM that are supposed to be designed to bring us closer together. And I don't know that they've met with the kind of success that they had set out to. So I think that CARICOM needs to be reformed, to be very honest.
Yeah. And actually, if we follow on to that, there's another question here that's posed that it's asking, so what industries do you think we should be putting our resources into?
Yeah, I think that for sure, renewable energy. Globally, there's been more and more decarbonization, but we have some of the highest costs of electricity and fuel in the world, and that makes us relatively less competitive and relatively less efficient. So this is putting aside all of the climate change and ecological damage that we've done by being so dependent on fossil fuels. Okay.
Right.
I just think from a purely economic and industrial standpoint, we need to focus on renewable energy. I also think that agriculture, we have these sort of, historically based or historically derived aversions to agriculture because it reminds us of slavery and indentureship and so on and so forth. But, it's time to stop thinking about agriculture in those terms. Because modern agriculture has allowed a country like the Netherlands, which is mostly water, to be one of the nations that feeds and provides, a significant proportion of the world's food. So if they could overcome all of this water, we can overcome our, how should I say, our biases and our complexes as it relates to agriculture. So I think agriculture is important, and I think it could make a big difference in socioeconomic success, even if it's cannabis, even if it's stuff that we can't, like, I don't know if you all ever noticed in Curacao, for example. Curacao is a desert. All they can grow there is aloes. Yet still, they grow tons of aloes and they make everything you could think of with these aloes. I mean, all kinds of lotions and soaps and shampoos and whatever, you just name it. And so this is my point. My point is, if you find something that works in your geographic and climate, then why not make an industry of it? And I think the other thing we can really harness and focus on in this region and become experts at is climate adaptation. So when you look at, for example, when you look at e-government, and Estonia became the world's experts in e-government, so much so that they've made an industry of going out there and teaching everybody else and implementing e-government platforms for various countries. Even some of us here in the Caribbean, in the Cayman Islands, I know they've done some work there for you. Why can't we become experts at climate adaptation? Because we need it, one, and two, because we are well placed to adopt climate adaptive technologies and solutions, and then go out there and teach the rest of the world how to do it. And so that's the other thing I think we really could focus on and make an industry out of, and stop focusing only on, or mostly I should say, on tourism, which I think is not a model that really has worked for us. I really don't think it has. And I was actually quite pleased to hear your government announce that they're going to continue to ban cruise ships from coming for some time, and then they're going to set some quotas and limits as to how many cruise tourists can come in, because I really don't think that that's a sector or subsector that is beneficial to the community from a socioeconomic standpoint. I really don't think so. I think it's a net cost. You think about the amount of garbage and the risks. I mean, the cruise ships were a vector for the spread of this pandemic. Okay, that says something.
You're very right about that. And just coming out from the background that I have, there's this conversation about how we revisit the model for tourism for the Caribbean. But when you talk about thought leadership, we are so hooked sometimes as a region in traditional models. We don't understand the potential for us, as you talk about even things like climate adaptive solutions, the ability for us. And we have the talent. It's not that we don't have the talent and the expertise in our region to globally be positioning ourselves a certain way. And, so this idea of thought leadership, this idea of bringing out your experts and allowing them to speak and to push the forefront of alternative options and industries is very, very important. So we have another question. It says, you spoke of picking a side, which is important to create a thought leadership brand. How did you develop the courage to share your perspectives?
Well, I think that, I don't know that I would say that it requires courage. I think that whenever faced with a particular subject, like let's say this whole thing about tourism, I think what's important in the first place is to look at the data and to read different, and to be open to different perspectives and hear different perspectives, but go back to the data. And the reason why I feel like tourism hasn't worked for us is because when you look at the balance of payments accounts for most of the countries in this region that are tourism dependent, they're running current account deficits. And any country that is a current account deficit on your balance of payments means that you're importing more than you're earning from exports. So it means that even though we're tourism dependent, we're importing so much to service this tourism sector that we're not recouping it. And so what that means is that it's a net drain on the foreign exchange of our economies, because a lot of the big hotels don't bring their US dollars onshore from their bookings. They leave it offshore in Panama and wherever. And so a lot of our small island economies, Cayman Islands is separate and very different in terms of their foreign exchange structure, and they run a currency board. So it's quite different. But going back to the question, I've digressed, sorry, about how, it's not even, I don't feel like it's about courage. I think it's about looking very dispassionately at the data, hearing the different sides of the arguments, but then going back to the data and looking at what it's telling you. And the facts don't lie. And so as controversial as it might seem sometimes, the facts don't lie. And I remember at RBC when I used to get into all kinds of trouble for saying things like I once had literally the president of a country say she needs to write an apology. And I said, but I got the data from your central bank website. What am I apologizing for? You know, they're the ones that said your unemployment was whatever it was, not me. You know.
Yes.
So my point is, it's not even about the courage. And my boss used to say, you can say whatever you want once you back it up with data, with facts. And so that is where the courage comes from. If it's a fact and you could defend your opinion and your argument with facts, then courage is not part of the equation.
So again, that's another tip. So it's this importance of, it's not just going out there with a free form opinion or perspective. It is heavily supported by your research and your data, so that you're speaking from a place of facts. And I think that that's important, because that also establishes, because no matter what happens, they have to respect what you're presenting, because it's hard to dispute because it's supported by the facts. So we have a comment here from a Miss Barnes, and she says, I'm in Cayman too, and hear what you say. This is talking of, again, going back to this idea of regional cooperation. And she says, last time I checked, Barbados had excellent literacy rates. I feel we should, as you were saying, Marla, I feel we should cooperate with each other on solutions and learning from each other's mistakes. The entire region should be collaborating more on agricultural solutions, ag tech, and so many other trades too. So we need to open up the region to trade with each other, reduce reliance on imports, and invest in our young farmers. So that was a comment there.
Agreed fully.
Another question is how do you maintain a work-life balance? And how do you deal with public criticism, particularly if it relates to insulating your family from a fallout? So what is your coping mechanisms?
Well, first of all, this whole thing about work-life balance, I think, is a lie. I do not have work-life balance. I don't know. And I think that it's something that's so individual, right?
Yes.
What does balance mean to you is not the same thing that it means to me. I think that once my kids are happy and well taken care of, then I think that I've done my job, right? Balance. Do I get enough exercise? No. Do I get enough sleep? No. Do I read enough? No. So no, as well, so to answer your question, how do I do not have what I would consider to be balanced, but my benchmark is, are my children happy and healthy and thriving? Yes, then okay. Then everything else can take a back seat. How do so in terms of insulating family from, that was one that was really, because I've had public spats with, all the time. The Minister of Finance in Trinidad and Tobago is one example. And there was this one time that what I had said was misconstrued. And it was at the front page of the newspaper that I supposedly said something to him that I did not. I made a comment that was not directed towards him. And I had to sit my children down before I dropped down to school that day and say, look, you're probably going to hear things that mommy said this and mommy said that. And I just want you to know that I did not. And two, you do not disrespect any grown up. And I had never disrespected, our Minister of Finance or anybody in authority. And you have to, and I've always tried to treat my children as though they were intelligent little people, and not pretend or not underestimate them. Because let me tell you, little children, it's easy to underestimate them, but we shouldn't, right? To our peril, we underestimate them. And I think that I would have these conversations with them. And there were times that I would be in tears, when a prime minister or minister of finance or whatever said something that was hurtful. And that happened for a while. And then now I just whatever, because you realize that politicians, it's all about posturing,
Right.
And rarely do they, I would suggest that they say things that, there is an agenda or as to why they're saying things. And sometimes they don't really believe, or they don't even really want to say some of the things that they say, but they say it because they have an agenda. And so you just don't take it personally. And I think that I learned that with time. So now I don't take things personally. There's nothing like practice, right?
Okay.
Practice.
Because I was going to say, and because again, when I look at some of the things now that you have your own brand, as you say, there are things that you're quite comfortable and confident saying, and you're not worried about that because of the support. So we are literally, the time is flying, Marla. Can you believe it? We're getting close to wrap up. But yes. I have fast and furious questions, but these two have been holding for a while, so I want to address them very quickly.
Yes,
you mentioned that women are not necessarily being heard in the room. What would you recommend for women to be heard by their male counterparts?
Well, we have to raise our sons better to start with. But I think that, there are lots of corporate training programs, especially at the senior management level that I'm aware of, that teach men how to not be toxic. And so maybe, and in this age of everything being online, there's lots of material online that can help to sensitize men about the way that they behave, when a lot of them don't even know. They don't even realize what they're doing. So there's lots of material out there if somebody really wants to determine if they have a challenge and how to address that challenge.
All right. And then, of course, for us ladies, it's just kind of, what the mechanisms we build in, then, to be able to be confident at the table, right?
Well, I would say in the first place, you have to do your homework, you have to have your facts, and you have to know what your position is. So you come into the room prepared, okay? And you have to be better prepared than the guys, okay? So that's your first thing. And, there are many times I would say things and almost nobody hears. And then a guy would say the same thing I just said in a different way 20 minutes later. Everybody in the room go, oh my God, that's brilliant. So that happens. It happens. Okay, it happens. And it doesn't only happen to women. It happens to men too. Right. So it happens. You have to learn not to take these things personally. But at the same time, don't be afraid to put your hand up and put your hand up and put your hand up and say, excuse me, I would like to say something. And then as Kamala Harris did during the debates, when then Vice President kept interrupting her and she said, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
There we go.
If somebody is persistently interrupting you, you tell them, listen, could you let me finish, please?
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to do that. And it's not rude to do that. I would
Yeah.
suggest you don't be rude, because then everybody's like, oh, she's such a bitch, you know. But
Mhm.
you just need to assert yourself and say, excuse me, I am speaking. Could you let me finish?
Yeah.
And then I think people get to realize, okay, maybe I shouldn't mess with her.
So my last question for you, before we wrap up, it comes from Trinidad. It says, I'm from Trinidad. I decided to leave the workforce for say and work directly with small entrepreneurs to develop their business capacities. As a finance and procurement professional, do you believe that the need to develop small and medium enterprises are crucial, SMEs are crucial to economic development?
Oh, certainly. I think that our entire economic model in the post-independence era is going to be turned on its head in the region. So what happened was we had, and I'm going to try to do this quickly, we had this model where the private sector was, the colonial masters, basically. And then we had independence, and the governments, the first governments we had in the independence era basically said, we will look after you,
Mm,
because all of this raping and plundering that took place, it was not good, and so
mhm,
we will look after you. So then we ended up with these very big bloated public sectors where governments
mm,
created work for their people, for their
right.
electorate, and to create dependency, basically, is what
Hmm,
happened. But now, having so many defaults in this region, so many governments, so many debt defaults, and so many governments that have mismanaged the economy, and then we have to get an IMF program and all of these things, then we realize that the public sector, the government, cannot sustainably create jobs, that it's really the private sector that
hmm,
has to be the engine of growth and the engine of job creation, which is why coming out of the IMF program in Jamaica, for example, their growth, they have a private sector led growth strategy, which Barbados is also embarking on, where you have to have these ease of doing business reforms, create a level playing field, make it easier to do business, and you let business thrive. And I think that
mhm,
that's the model that we're going to have going forward. And so, yes, small and medium enterprises, I think, are going to be the engine of growth, the engine of
mm.
job creation, and the backbone of our economies. In 20 years, that's where everything will be happening, as opposed to where we are now, where the government is the largest. Not so much in the Cayman Islands, but in other English-speaking Caribbean countries, the government is the
Right.
largest consumer, largest economic actor, largest creator of jobs, etc. That's not going to be the case for much longer.
Well, Marla, thank you very much. I'm so happy in terms of, just having you to be the guest for the launch of our season 2 of master classes, and for the information that you've shared. And, I made some notes as key takeaways for our audience. I'm so sorry we can't get to all of your questions, but thank you, because I see the comments coming in, some very solid nuggets. They're really happy. It was an informative session. So just, key takeaways of the idea of creating a thought leadership brand. And as Marla was speaking, we're realizing that in our region more and more, that's the call, for us, in terms of, as a region, being able to how we establish ourselves globally, but even in our own communities, how we can do the same. And so this idea of one, if you start with writing, being able to publish articles, and in the days of social media and blogging, you can get easier access to audiences to be able to start establishing yourself and your brand. Two, that if you have to then think about how you're going to be public facing and how you engage the audience. And when you are engaging the audience, is this idea of making a connection, because whatever you're sharing, anybody and everybody should be able to understand it and should be able to follow it, and it should make an impact on anyone in your audience. One of my favorites, have an opinion, don't sit on the fence, no one hand or the other. But that in order to get to that place that data becomes your friend. So having facts, the figures, the research that's required to balance your stories and opinions will help you to be able to be someone in the community who can give strong, thoughtful, thought-provoking, but also informative and correct information for the public. So I hope that you were able to enjoy those key takeaways. Help me in saying thank you again to Marla. Marla, absolutely fabulous. Been a blessing to have you. Thank you so much.